We have M2 benchmarks leaked, and they are better than we expected. The direction for iPadOS 16, the future of the M2 MacBook Pro, new AirPods, Mac gaming, whether it's worth buying the Mac Studio now, and Ultra MacBooks. Want the latest Apple news, leaks, and rumours? Subscribe and ring the bell. I'm Dave, and I simplify Apple so that everything just works for you. And if you want the latest Apple news, leaks, and rumours every weekday at 1300 UTC, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. Yes, I've brought that back because the plan is we're going to be back at 1 o'clock every day. That'll be nice, won't it? So we are going to talk through the M2 benchmark leaks and a whole bunch of other stuff. So let's get into it. Evan Rodgers asks, I gave answers. Discuss the benchmark leaks for M2, please, and thank you. Of course, this was exactly what we would have been talking about today, regardless of whether you had asked, but let's call this your question. So, first of all, we have got some leaked benchmarks. I'm not 100% sure that they are legit. They've been tweeted out looking like a screenshot from Geekbench 5. I think they probably are legit. They are in the ballpark of what we would expect. They're not sort of outlandish and all over the place, but we have a single core score of 1919 and a multi-core score of 8928. Now, of course, that means nothing without context, but let's have a look at the previous M1. When we look at the M1 MacBook Air, we're getting 1706 in single core, which is going up to 1919. That's a nice little jump, and you might be thinking, well, that's because it's got no fan in it. The MacBook Pro 13-inch had 1707, so it was 1 point faster. So we're talking about here around about just under a 20% increase. We were told 18% by Apple. That makes sense. So I think we're actually at about 19.5% as a percentage increase there. Now, when we look at the M1 cores, because the M1 cores are the same throughout the M1 range, so even when you go up to the Ultra, you are still using the same performance cores inside, and you can see this because the Mac Studio with the M1 Ultra inside gives 1755. Yes, it's slightly quicker, but obviously it has the much bigger cooling fans in there, and maybe they are putting an extra 0.01 volts or something through it, but not a huge difference regardless. Even if we were jumping from there to the new M2 chip in the MacBook Air, the M2 is substantially quicker on single-core tasks. Now, obviously, once we get into multi-core, this is where the M2 base chip, which is what we're looking at in the MacBook Air and the MacBook Pro 13-inch, that is where they're going to struggle compared to the competition. But the fastest non-Pro iMac that was ever released, this is the Intel one, was an i9-10910, and that scored 9,009 points. Now, 9,009 points versus 8,900 points. That's pretty close. So the fastest non-Pro desktop that Apple ever sold was basically the same speed as the new MacBook Air. That's pretty impressive to think about. So then when we go up to the 8-core MacBook Pro, this is the binned M1 Pro chip, you get 9511. So it is a little bit quicker. It's probably, what are we talking here, just over 5% faster? That's not a huge difference, 5 to 7% to go up to a $2,000 laptop instead of $1,300 if you're looking at the MacBook Pro 13-inch, or in fact $1,300 if you want it in a MacBook Air as well, because you're going to get a binned chip otherwise. I think the CPU chips are the same, but GPU you will get a little bit more performance by spending the extra $100. So I think that's pretty compelling. Obviously, these are unconfirmed, but they are in the ballpark of what we expected, so around about 20%, 19.5% faster on multi-core than M1, and 12%, 11.5%, 12% faster on single-core. I'm happy with that. That's not bad at all. And the big gains, remember, are in graphics, where we've got around about a 35% performance increase with the full-fat M2 chips, i.e. the ones that aren't binned with a couple of cores disabled. And also in the media engine, you've got the upgraded media engine that can do 2 streams of 8K ProRes, and I think they said 14 streams of 4K ProRes, or H.264, H.265, which is great. And it does suggest to me as well the fact that they are incorporating in the MacBook Air into the base M2 chip this 8K encoding and decoding. That suggests to me that the iPhone is going to be shooting 8K this year, so watch for that with the iPhone 14. Michael's Tech Talk, who, by the way, just hit 1,000 subscribers, congratulations, buddy, asks, iCave Dave, what's your thoughts on iPadOS 16, and do you think the iPadOS is going in the right direction? It's absolutely going the right way, it's just that we're not there yet. I think Stage Manager is a useful tool for people that are using their iPads regularly and want to use it as a kind of desktop option. I don't think it's the best option. I do think that the split screen is actually going to be more functional for the vast majority of people than using Stage Manager anyway. However, if you do want to be able to have overlapping windows, like I can see the appeal of being able to play a YouTube video in the background without having to pay for the premium, which at the moment you have to do. But you can have that in a window that's on the screen all the way through. Now, there is some controversy, and that is mainly because the iPad Air, the base model with the 64 gigs of storage on M1, does not have the memory swap controller that Apple said was vital to make this work, and yet it works on it. So, might want to get your story straight, Craig. Sorry. But yeah, I'm not a huge fan of the Stage Manager feature. We will try it out probably on the Mac once it becomes widely available, or at least once we get a public beta for it, but I'm not putting the developer betas on here. And also, if I did, the rules say that I'm not allowed to talk about it then. Alric Samuel Godfrey asks, iCave answers, now that the M2 MacBook Pros have been released, it's safe to say that they won't be sticking with the same design for the M3 upgrade. Would the 14-inch chassis and display become cheap enough to produce by then that they'd add that to the MacBook Pro M3, or do you think it would more likely be an M2 MacBook Air with a redesign, except being slightly thicker, along with getting a fan? So here's my theory on what they will probably do for an M3 MacBook Pro. If they want to do a redesign, I think it will probably be the 14.1-inch chassis. I think it will have slightly larger bezels than it currently does, and they will put the 13.6-inch display from the MacBook Air inside it. That would make the most sense to me, so you get some of the extra I/O. That would potentially mean that they're adding the extra display support as well, and that would potentially be a good differentiator between the M3 MacBook Pro and the M3 Pro MacBook Pros and the MacBook Air. It would actually give it its own place. However, there is also another possibility. 15-inch MacBook Air fills its spot, and it might just disappear entirely. But more on that later. Michael's Tech Talk asks, do you think the new AirPods Pro will drop at the iPhone event in September? We also had a question about this. Randomness R asking, iCave answers, will the new AirPods Pro 2 and AirPods Max come alongside the September iPhone, or will we have to wait until October and December for them to be released? So it seems to me to make sense to do these two together. I think that we are going to be looking at September for AirPods Pro and potentially AirPods Max. I think that there will be some new announcements around Apple's classical music service for Apple Music, which has its own app as far as we understand as well, and I think that it would make a lot of sense for them to launch those alongside potentially adding support for lossless audio. That would be a cool services thing to add along with the classical app, and then here's new AirPods that you can use to take advantage of that lossless audio with spatial audio and all the other stuff that Apple includes. I think we might basically see just a design refresh for the Pros, which don't particularly change the look of them, other than maybe one day we'll get colours, just like we have with the Maxes. New colours for the Max. The Max might potentially lose the crown, and it might lose things like the button that's on there, and they might go to the touch-sensitive surfaces, which is apparently what they wanted to do in the first place, but that remains to be seen. I think new colours, though, might well be the case. I'd love to see a pair of Midnight and Starlight AirPods Max and AirPods Pro. Marcin Kowalczyk asks, iCave answers, do you think Apple might go through with the EA acquisition after all? What would that mean for Mac gaming? Now, we did get Mac gaming mentioned at WWDC with talk of Metal 3 and also gaming controller support and buddy controllers, so that you can kind of either work with kids or anyone that needs more assistance with getting through games, where you can pair a pair of controllers to the same character and be able to take over to help get through tricky parts and that kind of thing. Now, the big thing that they were talking about was specifically around a couple of games where they're adding their own version of DLSS, I believe that's what it's called, which is basically upscaling the images. So the graphics card creates images at a lower resolution, then they're upscaled and detail is added post-processing. I'm not quite sure how, witchcraft presumably, but will the EA acquisition go through? There's not been any further talk on this. We know that EA is looking to be acquired, but we also know that EA's CEO wants to be in charge of whoever acquires him, which is a very strange way to be bought. Seems like you've got no money, but you would like to run a company with more money that can afford to buy your company. odd. Don't think it's going to happen, but somebody's going to buy it because they've got some good IP that is going to be useful going forward. Marcin Kowalczyk asks, I gave answers. With the order lag, is it sensible to order a Studio Ultra, assuming a valid use case for it at this point, or should I just wait for the M2 Ultra, since the M1 Ultra probably wouldn't arrive before Christmas, even if I ordered it today? Now, yeah, assuming that you have got a good use case for this, bear in mind that there is huge shipping delays on these things. I think it's somewhere around September right now, before you can actually get your hands on one of these. I don't know. Is my honest answer. I think we are going to see a Mac Pro very soon as well. Like, we've been told that it's coming. They've said it's for another day. Maybe that's going to be soon. The M1 Ultra Studio isn't going to be replaced until at least next spring. I wouldn't expect that they would refresh that within the year, but I think on the year might be where we see it. I think this September, October time, we're likely to see the MacBook Pros get the bump to M2 Pro and M2 Max, and also Mac Minis, probably with M2 and M2 Pro inside. That might be why we haven't seen them just yet, because they're waiting to put the M2 and the M2 Pro, which will be released in October, into that Mac Mini with its redesign, and that's the kind of big talking point in October, alongside the two MacBook Pros that don't get any design changes, but just that refreshed processor bump. So that would be my thoughts. I think it's going to be interesting to see what the performance gap is between an M2 Max versus the M1 Max and the M1 Ultra even. I think it's going to close the gap quite a bit. Evan Rodgers asks, I gave answers, do you think we will ever see the Ultra chip in a MacBook? Maybe the mythical 18-inch MacBook? I don't think so, because the power draw on it is so huge compared to everything else. It is drastically going to hit the battery life. Apple really focuses on getting the same battery life regardless of whether you are plugged into power or not for your MacBooks, and I don't think that would actually be possible in the M1 Ultra or the M2 Ultra, is my guess. They can't put a bit bigger battery in because the 16-inch MacBook Pro already has the biggest battery that you can fly with, so it's purely a case of you would take a hit on the battery life. So my thought is no, but never say never. Depends, maybe when we get a process size reduction, there is a chance that the efficiency gains are enough to allow it to happen, but that would be mind-blowing. And Evan Rodgers on Patreon has asked, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen because I forgot to put this on the teleprompter. When do you think we can realistically hope for an iPhone with an alternative display? In other words, a folding or rollable display. Samsung sells only 1/5 of Apple's intended volume with their flip/fold phones, so the technology doesn't seem to be ready. Would you even want a foldable phone? Number one, right now, no, I don't want a foldable phone. I have no interest in a foldable phone. But the reason for that is that nobody has come out with a compelling reason that a foldable phone is better in any way. So, yes, you get a slightly larger display, but you get an awful smaller display and a very thick phone when it's folded up. You get a larger, almost iPad-style screen, but not quite, when it's open, with a horrible fold down the middle of it, and it doesn't look very nice. It also means that your cameras are pointing in weird directions and aren't particularly easily used. What I am interested in is to see what Apple would do with this technology if they were able to. But honestly, I don't see a compelling use case for it. I don't think it's that important, and I think once we get to having the AR glasses, Apple Glass, as opposed to Apple Reality, which is what I'm calling the headset, I think it's going to be almost redundant. I think you can have virtual screens that are as big as you want once you get into AR and VR. So why would I want a chunky little foldy boy in my pocket? That doesn't make any sense to me. And if you want to be like Evan and ask me a question as a Patreon that I will then forget to put into the show until I look at it over on this big screen over here during the show, all you need to do is head over to patreon.com/iCaveDave or iCaveDave.com/Patreon. Either will work. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and we will see you in the next one. If you've got a question that you want to ask, by the way, #iCaveAnswers in the comments.